Throughout history, kings have sought immortality, wisdom, and control over life and death. From alchemists in dark towers to secret potions passed in golden goblets, monarchs have tried to outwit mortality itself. From an early age, the future king showed signs of brilliance, but not in the traditional arts of war or diplomacy. Instead, he was drawn to the study of the human form, fascinated by illness, aging, sensation. Servants and scribes were ordered to document everything: pulse, temperature, skin color, tremors, hallucinations. He exposed himself to diseases that ravaged the population, seeking to observe their progression firsthand. He demanded that his own blood be drained and replaced in small increments to test the limits of rejuvenation. Some of his procedures were inspired by ancient Egyptian embalming rituals, others by forbidden medical texts smuggled from distant lands. As the king pushed the limits of his flesh, those closest to him began to whisper that he had gone mad, but he insisted there was method in his madness. He no longer resembled the noble portrait that hung in the grand hall. Instead, he appeared ghost-like, covered in his veins visible like blue rivers beneath translucent skin. And then, in one final act of will, he ordered a mirror placed in front of him. But centuries later, fragments of his journals, offering insight into a king who dared to dissect the human soul through the slow unraveling of his own body. Here still, he smiled. Every wound, every fever, every moment of agony was a data point in his quest. He believed that to truly rule others, one must first understand the fragility of life. Not through theory, but through suffering. But despite his decline, he ruled with sharp intellect and chilling efficiency. Diplomats left his court uneasy, watching the skeletal figure in silk robes speak with perfect clarity about trade, war, and science, as if his mind had been sharpened by pain. And most of all, how far the body could be pushed before it failed. He would not wait for illness or age to claim him. He would orchestrate his own slow demise, documenting each phase. He described the fading of appetite, the blurring of vision, the silence of the heartbeat slowing. But he also wrote about moments of terrifying clarity, when he claimed to see the essence of life separating from matter. Some entries were pure science, others read like poetry or madness. Doctors and scribes were summoned to his private chambers, which had been transformed into a chamber of controlled decay. He had engineered a schedule of calculated organ failure, using drugs, poisons, and fasting to break down his body systematically, organ by organ. Educated in secret by physicians, monks, and even condemned heretics, he grew into a man obsessed with anatomy and experimentation, not only on others, but on himself. Yet among these rulers, one king's obsession with understanding the limits of the human body drove him to unthinkable lengths, using himself as the ultimate subject of his own twisted experiments. He was not merely a king of land and people. He attempted to become a master of flesh and decay, of pain and endurance, and eventually, of death itself. He was born during a time of political unrest, where superstition and science danced dangerously close. When his father died suddenly and he ascended the throne, many expected he would set aside his morbid interests in favor of governance. Instead, he turned the entire palace into a living laboratory. Medical scrolls filled the libraries, surgeons became royal advisors. The king began cataloging every sensation he experienced: hunger, thirst, exhaustion, pleasure, pain, with obsessive detail. But that was only the beginning. He began small, fasting for days, testing the effects of poisons in controlled doses, and recording how long he could go without sleep. Soon, the experiments became more invasive. He had sections of his own skin intentionally burned with rare chemicals to test pain thresholds. The royal court watched in horror as their king's body grew thin, pale, and scarred. Rumors spread throughout the kingdom. Some claimed he had become immortal. Others believed he had gone beyond the limits of humanity and was no longer truly alive. In his final year, the king announced his most radical experiment: to study the process of dying from the inside. He wrote extensively during this period. His journals, later called the Flesh Chronicles, detailed not only the physical sensations but the emotional and spiritual transformations he underwent. His final days were spent in near complete stillness, unable to move or speak. He communicated by blinking and nodding, dictating his last thoughts through a trusted scribe. After his death, the palace was sealed. Many believed it was cursed. His writings were hidden, and his experiments outlawed. As news of the king's final experiment spread beyond the palace walls, the kingdom found itself divided. Some viewed their monarch as a deranged tyrant, who had sacrificed his health and humanity in pursuit of forbidden knowledge. They feared that his obsession would inspire others to harm themselves in the name of science or enlightenment. His medical journals, instruments, and preserved tissues were locked away in the deepest vaults beneath the palace. Official records were rewritten to portray his death as peaceful, caused by a rare but natural illness. Though his rule had grown increasingly strange, he had maintained order and intelligence in governance. Some believed he had discovered a way to slow death and was still alive, entombed in a hidden crypt beneath the palace, his consciousness preserved through alchemical rituals. Others claimed that those who read his journals in full would lose their sanity or fall victim to the same obsession. His story became a legend whispered in the shadows of universities, inspiring cautionary plays and disturbing paintings. Artists portrayed him not as a hero or a monster, but as a man suspended between brilliance and ruin. His successors, less inspired and more fearful, avoided innovation. Superstition returned to court, and the thirst for knowledge was replaced by fear of punishment. Libraries were censored, scientific instruments were destroyed. A dark age descended, not for lack of brilliance, but for fear of becoming too much like the man who had once reigned. His public image was sanitized. Portraits were removing the scars and sunken eyes, replacing them with youthful, idealized versions. But the people remembered. Others considered him a visionary, a man who had pushed the boundaries of mortality in search of universal truths. It bore the unmistakable seal of the lost king. As Ulrich unraveled the brittle parchment, he discovered passages that mirrored modern concepts of cellular decay and immunity. Though the text was shrouded in metaphor and archaic language, the accuracy of the observations stunned him. He dedicated the next 20 years of his life to translating the journals and advocating for their inclusion in academic discourse. These groups believed he had unlocked hidden truths about the body and the soul, and that his spirit lived on within the pages of his journals. Was he a madman, a martyr, or the first true human experimentalist? As more of the journals were discovered, stored in crumbling libraries or hidden in old noble estates, a clearer picture began to emerge. The king had not been driven by a desire for fame or power. His writings revealed a deeply introspective man who feared death not for its pain, but for its silence. The idea that everything he had learned, felt, or known would vanish without a trace. Some followers engaged in their own acts of self-experimentation, often with tragic results. Others simply gathered to read his final writings aloud, treating them as sacred texts. The government tried to crack down on these groups, but the more they suppressed them, the more devoted they became. Whether seen as saint or lunatic, his actions ignited fierce debates among scholars, theologians, and future rulers. Smuggled excerpts from the king's journals began to circulate in intellectual circles. Some of the observations he recorded were astonishingly advanced for their time. Descriptions of blood circulation, nerve sensitivity, organ interdependence, several centuries ahead of modern science. These insights sparked both admiration and horror. Medical schools debated whether to include his findings in their teachings. Some hailed him as the progenitor of experimental medicine. Others refused to speak his name. The royal family, disturbed by the legacy he left behind, worked swiftly to suppress his writings. In the years following his death, strange cults emerged that worshipped the king as a martyr of knowledge. Outside the kingdom, foreign philosophers and physicians were fascinated by the rumors. Meanwhile, back in the capital, the king's absence was deeply felt. Over time, tales about the king took on mythic qualities. Centuries later, during a time of renewed intellectual curiosity, a young physician named Ulrich came upon a forgotten scroll buried in the archives of a decaying abbey. Ulrich's work reignited the debate about the king's legacy. The rediscovery of the king's work sent ripples through the world of science and philosophy. His notes, though cryptic and often poetic, contained profound insights into human biology, perception, and consciousness. Others warned against glorifying a man who willfully subjected himself to such brutal suffering. But beyond the ivory towers, the public fascination only grew. A new wave of experimental medicine, rooted in voluntary participation and precise methodology, was born. It contains a single sentence, written in trembling ink during his final days. To feel is to know, and to know is to live, even while dying. Though his methods will never be repeated, and though his name remains shadowed by controversy, his impact endures, a haunting reminder that sometimes the search for understanding demands more than books and theories. That phrase has become something of a mantra, not only for scientists, but for anyone who seeks truth in the darkest corners of human experience. While the brutal nature of his methods was never revived, his daring spirit inspired generations to look deeper into the body, not as something to be feared, but as a map waiting to be understood. Documentaries, books, and plays emerged, not only exploring the man himself, but also the moral questions he left behind. Historians began reevaluating not only the man's legacy, but the broader narrative of how knowledge is preserved, lost, and revived. Could one man's obsession with mortality teach humanity to better cherish life? These were the questions etched into the margins of his journals and the corners of every classroom that dared to discuss him. The king, once condemned and feared, now occupied a strange new space in the human story, a figure suspended between myth and medicine. In academic halls, heated arguments unfolded. Some scholars praised the king as a misunderstood genius, the forefather of modern experimental medicine. Was it right to treat the human body, even one's own, as a laboratory? Did the pursuit of knowledge justify pain? In secretive corners of the medical world, some quietly began building upon his theories. In a museum erected centuries after his death, one of his original journals now sits under glass, open to a single page. The king, who once isolated himself in a chamber of pain, has become a symbol of extreme curiosity, a tragic figure who tested the limits of body and spirit in a time that feared both. It demands the courage to bleed for the truth.